The night Cecily Hartwell left Ashmore House, she did not slam a door or weep on the step. She folded her note with the precision she had applied to every task in the 3 weeks preceding, placed it squarely on the household ledger where it could not be missed, pulled her cloak tight against the December cold, and walked down the service lane while the ballroom she had built still blazed with candlelight behind her. She did not look back. She had learned, by 23, the cost of looking back at things that were not hers. The ball had been perfect. She knew that without vanity, the way a carpenter knows a joint is true. The pine boughs had been dressed along the gallery rail with white satin ribbon, precisely as Lady Rosamond Vane had specified, and the hothouse gardenias had arrived on time because Cecily had written 3 separate letters to the florist at Covent Garden and followed each with a reminder. The supper table had been dressed in ivory cloth and set with the Ashmore silver, each piece counted, polished, and placed in the order Mrs. Partlow had approved from the diagram Cecily herself had drawn. 240 candles had been lit in the great chandelier by 7 o'clock, precisely as the household schedule Cecily had written and rewritten for a fortnight had required. The musicians had been placed at the north end of the ballroom floor, where the acoustics were warmest, and the drafts from the east door would not trouble them. Cecily had known about the drafts because she had stood in that room on 12 separate evenings, in the cold, working out exactly how the air moved. She had stood in the service corridor at 9 o'clock and watched through the half-open door as Edmund Vane, Earl of Ashmore, led Dorinda Fells onto the floor for the waltz. He had not looked toward the corridor. He had no reason to look toward the corridor. There was nothing in that corridor except bare stone, a footman named Peters trying not to yawn, and Cecily Hartwell in her plain gray gown with her household keys at her belt, watching 200 candles she had chosen and placed illuminate a man who did not know she existed. She had felt something settle in her chest then, quiet and final, the way a door settles when the latch drops home. She wrote the note in the household room at 11:30, while the dancing continued above her and the musicians she had hired played a reel she had selected from a catalog she had studied for 4 evenings. The note was 17 lines. It listed what remained undone and where to find the relevant correspondence. It gave the name of the florist and the reference number for the Covent Garden account. It thanked Mrs. Partlow for 2 seasons of employment and wished the household well. It said nothing else. She was through the kitchen passage and out the service gate by midnight. By morning she was 3 miles east, in the small lodging near Aldgate that her former schoolfellow Agnes kept above a milliner's shop, with a borrowed blanket and a cup of tea gone cold beside her, entirely alone. If she had known that Lord Ashmore would read the note 4 times before he set it down, she would not have believed it. Edmund found the note at 7 in the morning, before Mrs. Partlow had risen, because he had come down to the household room to look for the wine merchant's account. He had a headache from the previous night's burgundy, a cooler feeling toward Dorinda than he had expected to find in himself at the ball's end, and a general, gray irritation that he recognized and had no patience for. He picked up the note expecting a domestic memorandum. He read 17 lines in a hand, so even and deliberate it looked nearly typeset, and he stood there in the early winter light from the small casement window while the household began, slowly, to wake around him. The note contained no complaint, not a syllable of reproach. It was the absence of reproach that arrested him, the way a perfectly calibrated silence arrests a room trained to expect noise. 3 weeks of labor were accounted for in those 17 lines with the tone of someone reporting a completed commission to a client who need not be troubled with the effort it had required. He set the note down. He picked it up again. He read it a second time and a third, looking for what was not there. The way a man examines a wall where a painting is hung and feels the absence as a specific shape rather than mere blankness. "Who is Miss Hartwell?" he said, when Mrs. Partlow appeared in the doorway with her morning cap still unpinned. Mrs. Partlow looked at the note and pressed her lips together. "The household arranger, my lord. She has been with us this past fortnight and more." 2 seasons, Edmund said, because the note had said so, and he was still holding the note. He could see, from Mrs. Partlow's expression, that she had not known whether he knew or did not know, and that she was calculating how to answer. He found the calculation distasteful. He set the note down once, finally on the ledger, and told her to send Peters to discover where Miss Hartwell had gone. Peters was not equal to it. Edmund sent his own man, Carver, by 10 o'clock. Carver was a great deal more equal to it. By midday, Edmund knew that Miss Cecily Hartwell, 23 years old, was the daughter of one George Hartwell, formerly of Vine Street, Holborn, a man of modest means and considerable kindness, who had died 18 months prior of a fever, leaving his daughter his library, his debts to a sum of £60, and no other provision. She had entered domestic service within the month because she had refused, with a precision and quietness that several acquaintances had apparently found astonishing, to accept the offer of a distant cousin who wanted a companion in residence in exchange for housing, the exchange being a polite name for a form of servitude with no agreed termination. She had worked 2 seasons as a household arranger, first for a family in Marylebone and then, since October, for Ashmore House. Edmund sat with this information for the better part of an afternoon and found it doing something particular to a space behind his sternum that he had not been in the habit of attending to. He was not a man given to sentiment. He knew this about himself with the clear-eyed certainty of someone who has been told it often enough, in enough different ways, to have stopped arguing. His first wife, Charlotte, had died of a fever 3 years prior, in the 3rd autumn of their marriage, and she had died believing, as far as he could determine, that he saw the house and the title, and the obligations she represented more clearly than he saw her. He had not known she believed this until she was past the point of contradiction. He had not known it because she had been, by temperament and by habit, the kind of woman who arranged beauty for others from a position of near invisibility and expected, eventually, not to be seen. He recognized the type now. He recognized it with a sharpness that had nothing to do with sentiment and everything to do with the very specific quality of the 17-line note he had read 4 times that morning. He rode to Aldgate on Thursday. Carver had provided a direction above a milliner's shop, and Edmund presented himself at the door with a card and the particular stillness he wore when he was uncertain of his ground and unwilling to show it. The woman who answered was not Cecily. She was small and brown-haired, and she looked at his card with the frank alarm of someone who has never received an earl at her door before, and was not sure whether to be gratified or frightened. "Miss Hartwell is not receiving visitors," she said, with admirable steadiness. "I am not a visitor," Edmund said. "I am her employer." "You are her former employer," the woman said. And she was right, and he admitted it, and he asked to leave a note. He left a note. It said, "I require a meeting on a practical matter. I will return tomorrow at this hour." It was, he recognized as he folded it, a spectacularly cold thing to write to someone who had just worked 3 weeks without adequate acknowledgement, and he felt the specific inadequacy of it as he descended the step to where his horse was standing. He returned on Friday. He returned on Saturday. On Saturday, Cecily Hartwell came to the door herself. She was not what he had imagined, and he had not been aware he had imagined anything. She was slight, brown-haired, with careful eyes that assessed him the way a person assesses a room before committing to crossing it. Her gown was plain, and her shawl was borrowed, and she held herself with the very specific upright quietness of someone who has learned to take up as little space as the situation requires. She looked at him and said, "My lord," with no inflection whatsoever, which he found unexpectedly somewhat bracing. He said, "May I speak with you?" She said, "If you have come about the Covent Garden account, I left the reference number in the note." He said, "I have not come about the Covent Garden account." There was a pause in which she appeared to be deciding something. She let him in. They sat in the small parlor above the milliner's shop, with the smell of sizing and dried lavender coming up through the floorboards, and Edmund said what he had come to say, which was that he wished to offer her a continuation of employment with an adjusted compensation and a formal acknowledgment of her work, specifically that her name should appear in the household accounts in relation to the Winter Balls organization, which it had not done previously. Cecily listened to all of this with her hands folded in her lap and her expression entirely still. Then she said, "Why?" It was not a question in the grammatical sense. She did not end it with the rise of the voice that would make it a question. She said it in the tone of someone who genuinely wants to understand the mechanism behind an unexpected offer, and he found he could not give her the full answer in that parlor with the sizing smell and the borrowed shawl and her careful eyes waiting. He said, "Because the work was yours, and should have been recorded as such." She looked at him for a moment that lasted several seconds longer than was comfortable for him. "That is a very practical reason," she said. "I am a practical man." "Yes," she said, in a tone that conveyed a complete and measured opinion she was choosing not to voice. He left without settling the matter. He came back on Monday. He came back again on Wednesday. She let him in both times, and they spoke about the house, about the approaching Christmas arrangements, about a dispute she had observed between the cook and the wine merchant over the claret order that she had resolved by letter without telling anyone she had done so, and about a young housemaid named Nan, a girl of 16, who had been docked 3 weeks' wages by Mrs. Partlow for breaking a decanter that had, Cecily was quite certain, been broken already before Nan touched it. Edmund listened to the story of the decanter with more attention than a story about a decanter had any right to command. He listened to what was not said in it, that Cecily had told Mrs. Partlow the truth about the decanter, directly and at some personal cost to her own continued employment, because she could not leave a 16-year-old girl's wages to suffer for an accusation she knew to be false. He listened to the part of the story where she said, quietly, that Mrs. Partlow had not restored the wages. He noted, without commenting on it, that Cecily had spoken to Nan privately afterward and arranged to have the difference covered from her own quarterly sum. He did not say anything about this. He sat with it, as he had sat with the 17-line note. He carried it home the way a person carries something they have not yet found the right place for, and he set it next to the note's shape in the space behind his sternum. He was not surprised, by Thursday, to find that the space had become quite full. If you have found yourself in Cecily's place at any point in your own life, doing the unseen work and wondering whether it will ever be witnessed, stay close. This story is for you. Lady Rosamond Vane, Dowager Countess of Ashmore, had organized the social architecture of the family's position for 22 years, with a competence nobody thanked her for either, and she did not see the parallel and would not have appreciated having it pointed out. She was 61, narrowly built, and possessed of a manner so precisely calibrated to the level of the person she was addressing that most people never noticed they were being condescended to until they were safely home. She had identified Dorinda Fells as a suitable arrangement for her son some 18 months prior, on the logic that a woman of Dorinda's intelligence, beauty, and absolute social confidence would keep Edmund usefully occupied without making the kind of domestic claims that had made Charlotte so exhausting. Lady Rosamond had been fond of Charlotte in her way. She had simply found her, ultimately, ill-suited to the particular demands of visibility. She became aware of Cecily Hartwell's continued existence as late as the second week of December, through Mrs. Partlow's anxious report that his lordship had been making inquiries about the girl who had managed the winter ball and had subsequently paid 2 calls on a direction in Aldgate. Lady Rosamond absorbed this information with the outward composure of someone who has been absorbing unwelcome domestic intelligence for a great many years. Then she wrote 3 letters, one to the patroness of the subscription assembly rooms in Hanover Square, one to the wife of a senior member of her own social set who maintained a correspondence network of considerable range, and one to Mrs. Partlow, which arrived at Ashmore House the following morning, and which Mrs. Partlow read twice with a sinking expression before folding it into the small box she kept under the household desk. The letter instructed Mrs. Partlow to prepare and deliver a formal notice of termination to Miss Hartwell, effective immediately, on the grounds of abandonment of post. It was signed in Lady Rosamond's hand with the kind of precision that made the point about who held the relevant authority without needing to say so aloud. It also noted, almost in passing, that the patroness of Hanover Square had been informed that Miss Hartwell had left her last position without notice and had proven unreliable in a household of considerable standing, and that any future employer making application through proper channels would be advised accordingly. Cecily received the formal notice on a Tuesday morning, delivered by a boy from Ashmore House, who handed it to her with the blank face of someone who has been told not to wait for a reply. She sat with it in the small parlor for a quarter of an hour. She was not surprised. She had known, with the quiet certainty that had become her primary navigational instrument, that when she accepted Edmund's Wednesday invitation and allowed herself to return to the house to meet with Mrs. Partlow about the Christmas arrangements, she had stepped back into a field whose rules she understood completely and which were not designed to favor her. She was not without resources. She had Agnes, the borrowed blanket, and 61 shillings left from the previous quarter's wages after she had covered Nan's debt. She had 2 solid references from her Marylebone employer, which the Hanover Square letter would not entirely supersede if she moved quickly. She had her father's library, currently in storage with a carrier on Cheapside, waiting for a direction she had not yet secured. She had, she thought, her values, and the settled knowledge that she had acted on them, and the slightly grim private comfort of knowing that no one could take those. She put the notice in her pocket and went out to find Nan. She found her in the kitchen passage of Ashmore House on a Thursday afternoon, having sent word through Peters that she needed to speak to the girl. Nan appeared in the passage with red eyes and a frightened expression, and Cecily gave her the 3 weeks' wages from her own reticule in a folded piece of paper, and told her plainly that the decanter had not been her fault, and that she should not allow Mrs. Partlow to tell her otherwise. She told her this in a voice entirely devoid of drama or self-pity, with the household noise of the kitchen behind them and the cold stone of the service corridor around them, and Nan pressed the paper against her chest and looked at Cecily with something in her face that was not gratitude exactly, but something older and more steadying. Mrs. Partlow appeared at the end of the corridor. She had not expected to see Cecily. She had certainly not expected to see the reticule open or the folded paper in Nan's hands. Her expression moved through several phases in quick succession, ending on a compressed and unhappy authority. "Miss Hartwell," she said, "this is not appropriate." "No," Cecily said steadily. "It is not. The wages should have been restored 3 weeks ago, and I am returning them to Nan now because you have not. I would suggest that the account be corrected formally before year-end, since the discrepancy is recorded in the lower ledger and will be visible at the quarterly audit." Mrs. Partlow's jaw tightened. She was calculating, Cecily could see, whether the remark about the audit was a threat or merely a statement of fact. It was both, but gently and without malice, and Mrs. Partlow arrived at this conclusion after a moment and said nothing further, because there was nothing to say that would not make her position worse. Cecily nodded, told Nan to keep the money, and walked back down the service corridor toward the street. She did not know that Edmund had been in the house that afternoon. She did not know that he had been in the study on the first floor reviewing the wine merchant's quarterly account, and that from the study window the service corridor entrance was partially visible, and that he had seen her come in, and watched, with a stillness he recognized as distinct from his ordinary manner, the entire exchange through the glass. He knew about the wages before she arrived, because Nan had been crying in the hall that morning, and Carver had been thorough. He had not acted on it himself, though he had intended to, because Lady Rosamond had arrived at 10 o'clock and occupied the first half of his day with the particular quality of maternal management she had practiced on him since childhood, and which he had been, for 31 years, too disciplined and too loyal to name aloud for what it was. His mother had told him, with her calibrated composure, that Miss Hartwell had abandoned her post, had been found unreliable, and had been formally notified. She had told him that Dorinda had been asking about the 12th night assembly in Hanover Square. She had told him, with the particular delicacy she reserved for her most significant maneuvers, that she hoped he was not proposing to let a household arranger's departure become a matter of consequence when there were perfectly satisfactory arrangements already in place. Edmund had listened to all of this. He had listened with the same quality of still attention he had given to the 17-line note, to the parlor above the milliner's shop, to the story of the decanter. He had said very little, as was his custom, and Lady Rosamond had taken his silence, as she had been taking his silence for 31 years, for a form of agreement. She was not right this time. She could not know she was not right, because she had not yet seen him look out of a study window at a young woman in a borrowed shawl standing in a service corridor returning wages to a frightened girl out of her own pocket, with no one watching and no recompense expected, and her formal dismissal already in her coat. The Ashmore Winter Assembly was the following Thursday. Lady Rosamond had arranged it, as she arranged all things, thoroughly. The same ballroom, the same candlelit gallery, the same musicians placed at the north end where the acoustics were warmest. The difference was that the candles this time had been dressed by a hired firm that Lady Rosamond's correspondent had recommended, and they sat approximately 1.5 inches lower than they should have done, and the effect was perceptibly flatter than the previous week, though no one in the room except Cecily would have known exactly why. Cecily was not in the room. She was, by Lady Rosamond's design, not in any position to be in the room. She was in the borrowed parlor in Aldgate, with Agnes's fire and a cup of tea and the 61 shillings, making practical calculations about Bristol, where the Marylebone family had a connection who might want a household arranger for the spring. The gathering had been underway for perhaps 40 minutes when Thomas Dowell, a solicitor of middle age and considerable discretion, arrived at the main entrance of Ashmore House and asked for his lordship. He had been sent for. Edmund had sent for him that morning with a specific and unusual commission, and Dowell had spent the day preparing the relevant document with the care appropriate to a formal declaration of intent, signed, witnessed, and sealed. Dowell was admitted. He was shown to a small anteroom off the main hall. He waited. Edmund found him there at 9:15, excused himself from the drawing-room where Lady Rosamond was performing her management at her finest pitch, took the document, read it, folded it into his coat, and walked back into the hall. Lady Rosamond was at that moment delivering a remark to the wife of Lord Fenwick about the inadvisability of hiring unknown persons through informal recommendation rather than through the established channels of introduction, which remark she had positioned to be audible to the small cluster of guests in her immediate orbit. She was in the flow of it. She did not see her son cross the hall. He sent Carver to Aldgate in the carriage at 9:23. Cecily was in the borrowed parlor when the knock came. She heard Agnes go to the door, heard the low murmur of a man's voice, and then Agnes appeared in the parlor doorway with an expression she had not worn before, a quality of held breath that had nothing practical in it. "There is a carriage," Agnes said. "Lord Ashmore's man. He says you are requested." Cecily sat with this for precisely 1 moment. Then she stood, put on her coat, and went to the door. Carver held the carriage door with the careful neutrality of a man executing an instruction whose full implications he had understood and respected. Cecily got in. The carriage moved. She sat in the dark interior and watched the December streets pass and felt, with the equanimity she had assembled over 2 seasons of invisible labor and 1 December of particular difficulty, that whatever was at the end of this journey, she would meet it on her own terms, or she would meet it as herself. And those 2 things were the same. The carriage drew up at Ashmore House, not the service entrance. The main door. Peters was at the step. Peters, who had been trying not to yawn in the service corridor a fortnight ago, was at the main step, and he held the door with an expression of considerable relief, as though something that had been slightly out of order was now being corrected, and he personally approved. She went in. The hall was warm and lit, and smelled of the beeswax and pine she had ordered 3 weeks ago, which Mrs. Partlow had apparently not thought to discontinue. She could hear the gathering from the drawing-room, the low accumulated sound of a considerable number of people in good standing, conducting good standing at one another. She could hear, faintly, the musicians at the north end playing a piece she recognized because she had selected it. Edmund came out of the drawing-room into the hall. He stopped when he saw her, and for a moment he simply looked at her, the way she had caught him looking twice before, and misread both times as the casual assessment of an employer. She did not misread it now. It was too direct, too still, too specifically trained on her face, and not the room. He said, "Miss Hartwell," she said. "My lord," he said. "Will you come in?" It was not a question. It had the form of his customary short declarative command, the kind she had categorized in the early weeks as evidence of indifference. She understood now that it was a form of care in a man who had learned to keep care rigorously controlled, and that the instruction, in his vocabulary, meant something closer to, "I want you here, and I am not yet certain I have earned the right to say so in any other form, so I am saying this." She came in. The room was large, warm, and full of people. 200 candles, a little too low in their dressings but still beautiful, caught on the Ashmore silver and the diamond earrings of several women whose names Cecily knew from the household accounts, and who turned now to see who had entered at the main door with Lord Ashmore at her side. Lady Rosamond was seated near the east window. She turned. She took in Cecily with one comprehensive glance, and Cecily felt the weight of the glance as a physical event, the accumulated authority of 22 years of social management concentrated and applied. Dorinda Fells stood 3 feet away in silk the color of winter sky, with the particular composure of a woman who has not yet understood that composure is about to be required rather than offered. Mrs. Partlow was present at the edge of the room. She stood very still. Edmund said, in the carrying voice of a man accustomed to the room's attention falling where he placed it, "I will ask for your attention for a moment." The room gave it. This was not a request that required repetition. He said, "You will have enjoyed the winter ball last week, which was generally agreed to be the finest Ashmore House has presented in some years. The arrangement of the room, the musicians, the table, and every element of the evening from the first preparation to the final candle was accomplished by Miss Cecily Hartwell, who was employed as household arranger for that purpose, and whose name has not appeared in any accounting of the evening's success. I am correcting that omission. The room was quiet. Lady Rosamond's fan, which had been moving at a measured height, was still. "I have engaged Mr. Dowell," Edmund continued, with the same level tone, "to prepare a document formalizing my intention to offer Miss Hartwell a permanent position in this household in the capacity of its mistress, pending her acceptance, which I have not yet had the opportunity to request." He turned to Cecily. He looked at her with the direct quality she had not yet, even now, entirely grown accustomed to. He said, "Miss Hartwell, Cecily, I have been a man who did not see the work in front of him until it was gone. I will not be that man twice. Will you stay?" It was 4 words at the end. Will you stay? Not will you marry me, not I have loved you from the first, not any of the elaborate declarations the room had probably been half expecting. It was what he meant, and it was the only thing he meant, and she understood it entirely. She was silent for a moment. She was aware of the room around her, of Lady Rosamond's arrested fan, of Dorinda's still profile, of Mrs. Partlow at the edge, of Nan, who had found her way to the doorway from the service corridor and was standing there in her household apron with her hands pressed together. She said, "Yes." The room exhaled. It was not a dramatic collective sound, nothing so theatrical as a gasp. It was the particular quality of breath a room releases when something that was uncertain is now certain. When the hierarchy's pending machinery has encountered a gear it did not expect, and has, after a moment's resistance, accepted the new arrangement as correct, Dowell came in from the anteroom and delivered the sealed document with the composure of a man who has participated in significant events before and knows that his function is to be present and exact, and then to depart. Which he did. Lady Rosamond sat for a moment with her fan in her lap. She was not a stupid woman. She was a woman who had organized the world according to a script that had worked reliably for decades. And she was sitting, now, at the precise moment when the script had failed, and she could feel, with the particular acuity of someone whose identity is organized around her position, that she was being observed, feeling it. She rose, eventually. She moved toward Cecily with a deliberateness that was not warmth, but was not hostility. And she said, in a voice that had shed its calibrated edge, "Miss Hartwell?" Cecily looked at her steadily. "My son," Lady Rosamond said, after a pause that cost her something visible, "has not been wrong before about the quality of what he attends to. I find I must trust that he is not wrong now." It was not an apology. It was the closest thing to one that 22 years of formed character could produce in the space of 30 seconds, and Cecily accepted it with a small, courteous inclination of her head, because that was what grace required, and because cruelty toward a woman being corrected in public served nothing she believed in. Dorinda left the room quietly. The room did not remark on it. The crowd's verdict, once turned, required no additional confirmation, and no one felt moved to compound the reversal with commentary. The gathering, after a short period of adjusted murmuring, resumed its usual weather. The musicians, who had paused with the professional alertness of people trained to read a room, played on. Edmund stood beside Cecily and said nothing for a moment. Then he said quietly, "I had not planned the speech." "I know," she said. "Was it very inadequate?" She considered the question with the same honest attention she gave everything. "No," she said. "It was the right length." Something crossed his face then, very quickly, the nearest thing to relief she had seen on features that had been arranged against it, for as long as she had known them. It changed the angle of his jaw and the set of his eyes, and left him, briefly, looking less like the Earl of Ashmore, and more like a man of 31 years who had carried a specific weight for a long time and had recently set it down. He offered her his arm. She took it. They crossed the room together, and the room made way for them, as rooms do when the person at the center of them is finally standing in her correct place. Quiet is a word that does not capture what Cecily felt in the weeks that followed, but it is the nearest one. Quiet and full. The two things together. The announcement was formalized the following week through the appropriate correspondence, and Thomas Dowell's document was presented to the relevant family authorities in the proper order, and the machinery of Regency propriety moved through its required stages with the implacable patience it always brought to matters it had initially resisted. Lady Rosamond was present at the formal meeting and said, from her position near the window, very little, and what she said was not unkind. Christmas came to Ashmore House with snow. Cecily stood at the window of the room she had been given, which was on the second floor and looked out over the south garden, and watched the snow come down over the topiaries she had admired 3 weeks ago from the service lane. The garden was entirely white. The lawn was entirely white. The box hedges along the south wall wore snow on their flat tops like small, even hats, and the light that came off all of it in the early morning was the particular cool silver of a winter day at its best. Her father's library had been brought from the carrier on Cheapside and arranged against the west wall by Peters and a second footman, who had been told to be careful with the calf-bound volumes and had been, with a seriousness that would have gratified her father greatly. The tallest shelf still lacked a complete row, because 3 volumes were somewhere in the packing that had not been opened yet, and the gap in the row was the only incomplete thing in the room, and she found she did not mind it. Things could be complete over time. Edmund knocked and came in at 8 o'clock, as he had taken to doing, with a look of calm inquiry that was his version of asking how she had slept. She told him well. He looked at the library, and then at the window, and then at her, and she felt that quality of attention that she was still, slowly, learning to receive without deflecting. He said, "It is very cold for the garden. You would want your heaviest cloak." She said, "Are you suggesting a walk?" He said, "I am suggesting you might want one. I will be available should that be the case." The garden was indeed cold, cold in the specific December way that makes breath visible and footsteps sound very clean, and they walked the south path with their breath in small white clouds before them, and the snow undisturbed on either side. Edmund said little, as was his custom. She said what she wanted to say, which was more than she had said to anyone in 2 seasons, and he listened with the full quality of attention that she had spent 2 seasons not quite believing was real, and was now discovering was simply how he was made. Nan appeared in the kitchen doorway at the far end of the garden, with a shawl pulled around her shoulders, and a smile so wide it was nearly audible, and she waved once, with the large, unceremonious wave of a 16-year-old girl who has no idea that she is completing a picture, and went back inside. Cecily watched the kitchen door close and felt the weight of everything that had preceded this morning arrange itself into something she had not expected. Not triumph, not relief, exactly. Though it was that too. Something steadier and more permanent. The feeling of a person who has stood in enough cold corridors to know, finally and in the body, what warmth means. She had spent 2 seasons building beautiful rooms for other people to live in. She had not thought, when she placed the note on the household ledger and walked out the service gate before dawn, that she was beginning anything. She had thought she was ending. She had thought she was preserving, at very modest cost, the only thing she had left, which was her own clear knowledge of what she was worth and what she would and would not accept. She had been right to leave. She was right now to stay. She slipped her hand through Edmund's arm and felt him cover her gloved fingers with his own in the quick, contained gesture that was his version of holding on. The snow came down on the south garden of Ashmore House, even and quiet and patient, covering everything equally, and she was warm. If Cecily's story reached something in you, leave a word in the comments about what you recognized in her. Stories like hers exist because someone took the trouble to look, and so do channels like this one.